Picture this. It's August 6, 1945, and a single plane flies over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, the world changes forever. In one blinding flash, 70,000 people vanish in an instant, not wounded, not fleeing, just gone. Erased from existence in less time than it takes you to snap your fingers. The temperature at ground zero reaches 10 million degrees. Human shadows are burned into concrete. A mushroom cloud rises 8 miles into the sky. And just like that, humanity crosses a threshold it can never uncross. But here's the thing that'll really mess with your head. This moment, this apocalyptic culmination of human destructive power, was just the ending. The final punctuation mark on a story so massive, so catastrophically brutal, that it killed between 70 and 85 million people. That's roughly 3% of everyone alive on Earth at the time. To put that in perspective, if the same percentage died today, we'd be looking at over 200 million corpses. World War II wasn't just a war, it was a civilizational cataclysm that fundamentally rewrote the rules of how nations interact, how weapons work, how governments control their people, and what depths of horror human beings are capable of inflicting on each other. And it all started not with a bang, but with a lie. September 1st, 1939. The place is Gliwice, a small German town on the border with Poland. Or rather, what's about to become the former border with Poland. The night before, something strange happened at the local radio station. A group of men burst in, seized the transmitter, and broadcast an anti-German message in Polish. They left behind a dead body dressed in a Polish military uniform as evidence of this brazen attack on German soil. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, has all the justification he needs. Germany, he declares, is simply defending itself. The invasion of Poland begins at dawn. German tanks roll across the frontier. Luftwaffe bombers darken the skies. The Wehrmacht, Germany's military machine, crashes into Poland with devastating force. Here's the problem. That entire radio station incident was staged. The Polish attackers were actually SS troops in disguise. The body left behind, a concentration camp prisoner murdered specifically to serve as a prop. The whole thing was a false flag operation, codenamed Operation Himmler, designed to give Hitler his pretext for war. And the world fell for it, at least initially. Not that it ultimately mattered whether they believed it or not. But let's back up, because World War II didn't really start on September 1st, 1939. Not really. The seeds were planted more than 2 decades earlier in the ashes of the previous global catastrophe we now call World War I. When that conflict finally ground to its bloody conclusion in 1918, Germany was crushed. Not just defeated militarily, but economically gutted, territorially carved up, and psychologically humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to ensure peace. Instead, it planted the seeds of an even greater conflict. Germany lost 13% of its territory and all its overseas colonies. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr was occupied. The military was restricted to a laughably small force. And here's the kicker. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for starting the war and had to pay massive reparations to the victorious Allies. We're talking billions of dollars, an astronomical sum that crippled the German economy for years. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democratic government established after the war, struggled under this burden. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s became so severe that people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. Life savings became worthless overnight. The middle class was wiped out. And into this chaos stepped a failed Austrian painter with a toothbrush mustache and a talent for speeches that could whip crowds into a frenzy. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, promised to restore German greatness. They promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. They promised to make Germany powerful again, to reclaim lost territories, to purify the nation. And they had a convenient scapegoat for all of Germany's problems: the Jews, along with communists, homosexuals, Roma, and anyone else deemed undesirable by their twisted ideology. Now, Hitler didn't just magically take power. The Nazi Party actually lost seats in the November 1932 elections. But political maneuvering, backroom deals, and the miscalculation of conservative politicians who thought they could control Hitler led to his appointment as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Within months, he had consolidated absolute power, transforming Germany from a struggling democracy into a totalitarian dictatorship. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave him the excuse to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act in March gave him the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. By the time President Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler had merged the offices of Chancellor and President, becoming the Führer, the absolute leader of Germany. Opposition parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. The press was muzzled. The Gestapo, the secret state police, began rounding up political enemies. Concentration camps, initially for political prisoners, began to fill. And Hitler's grand vision, laid out years earlier in his rambling manifesto Mein Kampf, began to take shape. That vision had several key components. First, the unification of all German-speaking peoples into a greater Germany. Second, the acquisition of Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe, where Germans could expand and subjugate or eliminate the Slavic peoples Hitler considered racially inferior. Third, the complete destruction of what the Nazis called Judeo-Bolshevism, the supposed Jewish communist conspiracy they blamed for Germany's woes. And fourth, the establishment of a 1,000-year Reich, a German empire that would dominate Europe for centuries. Ambitious? Absolutely. Insane, without question. But here's the terrifying part. He almost pulled it off. Hitler began testing the waters in the mid-1930s. In 1935, he openly announced Germany's rearmament, directly violating the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations, that toothless predecessor to the United Nations, essentially shrugged. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France. This was a massive gamble. Hitler's generals were nervous. If France had responded with force, the small, poorly equipped German force would have been crushed. But France did nothing. Britain did nothing. Hitler's bet paid off, and he learned a crucial lesson. The Western democracies were weak, indecisive, and terrified of another war. They could be pushed. Meanwhile, another aggressive regime was making moves on the other side of the world. Japan, an island nation with limited natural resources and imperial ambitions, had been expanding into China since 1931, when it seized Manchuria. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, beginning what would become a horrifically brutal conflict. The Rape of Nanking, also known as the Nanjing Massacre, occurred in December 1937 when Japanese troops captured the Chinese capital. Over a 6-week period, Japanese soldiers murdered an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Women and girls were systematically raped. Bodies filled the streets. The atrocities were so extreme that even Nazi officials in the city were horrified and tried to protect Chinese civilians. The war in China would rage for years, often overshadowed by events in Europe, but it was very much part of the same global conflict. Back in Europe, Hitler was just getting started. In March 1938, he orchestrated the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. German troops marched into Vienna to cheering crowds. Austria, Hitler's birthplace, was now part of Greater Germany. Again, the international community protested weakly but did nothing substantive. Emboldened, Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a border region with a large ethnic German population. He demanded it be handed over. War seemed imminent. And then came one of the most infamous moments of the entire prelude to World War II, the Munich Conference. In September 1938, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich to decide Czechoslovakia's fate. Notice who wasn't invited: Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was desperate to avoid war. He believed Hitler's assurances that the Sudetenland was his last territorial demand in Europe. The result was the Munich Agreement, in which Britain and France essentially handed over the Sudetenland to Germany without Czechoslovakia's consent. Chamberlain returned to London, waved the agreement in the air, and declared he had achieved peace for our time. He couldn't have been more wrong. Within 6 months, Germany had seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. The policy of appeasement, the strategy of giving Hitler what he wanted to avoid war, had failed spectacularly. All it had done was give Germany time to rearm and shown Hitler that he could take what he wanted without serious opposition. But Hitler had one more diplomatic masterstroke up his sleeve before launching his war, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, bitter ideological enemies, announced a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who signed it, publicly pledged that the two nations wouldn't attack each other. But the real bombshell was in the secret protocol. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be carved up. The Baltic states would go to the Soviets. Hitler had secured his eastern flank. He no longer had to worry about fighting a two-front war, the nightmare that had doomed Germany in World War I. Now he was free to move against Poland. Stalin, the Soviet dictator, got breathing room and a buffer zone. Both men were buying time, each planning to eventually betray the other. But for now, their pact sealed Poland's fate. So, when German forces crashed into Poland on September 1, 1939, the Polish military fought bravely but was hopelessly outmatched. The Germans introduced the world to Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a new form of warfare that combined fast-moving armored units, mechanized infantry, and close air support to punch through enemy lines and encircle opposing forces. It was devastatingly effective. Polish cavalry, yes, actual cavalry on horseback, found themselves facing German panzers. Within days, the Polish army was in disarray. And then, on September 17th, the Soviets invaded from the east, claiming they were protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. Poland was being crushed from both sides. By early October, it was over. Poland had been conquered and divided between Hitler and Stalin, just as they'd secretly agreed. But here's where World War II officially becomes a world war. Britain and France had guaranteed Polish independence. They'd promised to come to Poland's aid if Germany attacked. So on September 3, 1939, both nations declared war on Germany. Finally, the appeasement was over. Finally, the democracies were taking a stand. Except they didn't actually do anything. Despite declaring war, Britain and France launched no significant offensive to help Poland. This period became known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. For months, the Western Allies and Germany stared at each other across fortified lines with little actual fighting. Britain and France were buying time to mobilize and rearm, but so was Germany, and Hitler was planning his next move. The Phony War ended with a bang in April 1940 when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway in Operation Weserübung. Denmark fell in hours. Norway resisted but was overwhelmed within weeks, despite British and French attempts to intervene. Germany now controlled crucial naval bases and secured the supply of Swedish iron ore, vital for its war industry. But this was just the appetizer. The main course came in May. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Fallgelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. German forces swept into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg simultaneously. The Dutch fought for 5 days before surrendering after the Luftwaffe bombed Rotterdam into rubble, killing nearly 1,000 civilians. Belgium lasted longer but couldn't stem the tide. The French and British had expected Germany to repeat its World War I strategy, attacking through Belgium. They'd prepared for that, moving their best forces north to meet the threat. But the Germans had a surprise. The main thrust came through the Ardennes forest, a heavily wooded region that the French had considered impassable for tanks. They were catastrophically wrong. German panzer divisions burst through the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, punching a hole in the French lines. They then executed a brilliant maneuver, racing west toward the English Channel, cutting off the French and British forces that had moved into Belgium. Within 10 days, the Allied armies were trapped in a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. It looked like a complete disaster, the destruction of the British Expeditionary Force and France's best divisions, and then something remarkable happened. Between May 26th and June 4th, Operation Dynamo evacuated over 300,000 British and French soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk. A flotilla of over 800 vessels, including destroyers, fishing boats, pleasure craft, and anything else that could float, shuttled troops across the English Channel under constant German attack. Luftwaffe bombers pounded the beaches. German artillery shelled the harbor. But the Royal Air Force fought desperately to provide cover, and a controversial German halt order, possibly issued by Hitler himself, gave the Allies precious time. Dunkirk was a tactical defeat, no question. The Allies left behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, and artillery. But it was also a strategic miracle. Britain had saved its army. The troops would live to fight another day. And the Dunkirk spirit, the idea of perseverance against overwhelming odds, became a defining moment of British resilience. France, however, was doomed. German forces turned south, smashing through the remaining French defenses. The French fought in places, sometimes fiercely, but the campaign was lost. The government fled Paris. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into the French capital, parading down the Champs-Élysées in a humiliating display of conquest. The French government, now led by the elderly World War I hero Marshal Philippe Pétain, sued for peace. On June 22nd, in a deliberate act of symbolic revenge, Hitler had the armistice signed in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. France was divided. The North and West, including Paris, came under direct German occupation. The South became Vichy France, a collaborationist puppet state led by Pétain that would shamefully cooperate with the Nazis. A small group of French resistors, led by Charles de Gaulle, escaped to Britain and vowed to continue the fight, but for now, France had fallen. In 6 weeks, Germany had conquered France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The same France that had held out for 4 years in World War I, the speed and completeness of the victory shocked the world. Britain now stood alone in Western Europe. Hitler controlled the continent from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. And across the English Channel, Winston Churchill, who had replaced the discredited Chamberlain as Prime Minister, prepared his nation for the fight of its life. In one of history's greatest speeches, delivered on June 4th after Dunkirk, Churchill told the House of Commons and the world, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Britain was battered, isolated, and facing the most powerful military machine on the planet, but it wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate. It made sense from his perspective. France was defeated. The British Army had been humiliated at Dunkirk. The Royal Navy was powerful, sure, but Germany controlled the entire European coastline. What could Britain possibly do except accept reality and make peace? Hitler even made several public peace overtures, offering to guarantee the British Empire in exchange for a free hand in Europe, but Churchill wasn't Chamberlain. Churchill understood that any peace with Hitler would be temporary, that Nazi Germany represented an existential threat not just to Britain but to Western civilization itself. So Britain fought on, and Hitler, frustrated by British stubbornness, decided that if Britain wouldn't make peace, he'd invade. The plan was called Operation Sea Lion, and it required one crucial prerequisite: air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. Thus began the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. Starting in July 1940 and continuing through October, the Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of attacks against British targets. The initial phase targeted shipping and coastal installations. Then the Germans shifted to attacking RAF airfields and aircraft factories, trying to destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground and in the air. Ermengring, the portly, metal-bedecked head of the Luftwaffe, was supremely confident. He had more planes, more pilots, more resources. Victory seemed inevitable. But he underestimated several critical factors. First, the British had radar. This revolutionary technology, still in its infancy, allowed British controllers to detect incoming German formations and vector RAF fighters to intercept them. Instead of wasting fuel on constant patrols, British pilots could be scrambled when needed. It was a massive force multiplier. Second, the British were fighting over their own territory. When a German plane was shot down, the pilot was captured or killed. When a British plane went down, the pilot often parachuted to safety and could be back in the air within hours. Third, British aircraft production, overseen by the brilliant and ruthless Lord Beaverbrook, actually outpaced German production during the critical summer months. And fourth, the British had something intangible but crucial. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their survival. The German pilots were fighting for conquest. The aerial battles were ferocious. Young men, many barely out of their teens, climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes and dueled with Messerschmitt fighters at 300 miles per hour, 6 miles above the English countryside. As Churchill famously said, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The RAF pilots, the few, were holding the line against Hitler's war machine through sheer skill and courage. But they were being ground down. By early September, the RAF was on the ropes. Fighter Command had lost a quarter of its pilots. Airfields were cratered. Replacements couldn't keep up with losses. If the Luftwaffe had maintained its focus on destroying the RAF, Operation Sea Lion might have become possible. But then Hitler and Göring made a catastrophic mistake. On September 7, 1940, they shifted their focus from RAF airfields to London itself. The Blitz had begun. Night after night, German bombers droned over London, dropping high explosives and incendiaries on the city below. The East End burned. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Londoners huddled in tube stations, using the underground as bomb shelters. Over 40,000 British civilians would die during the Blitz, and over 1 million homes would be destroyed. It was horrific. It was traumatic. But strategically, it was a blunder. The pressure on the RAF eased. Airfields were repaired. Pilots' strength recovered. And by late September, it was clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. On October 12, 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain had survived. It was the first major German defeat of the war, and it had enormous implications. Britain remained unconquered, a thorn in Hitler's side, a base from which the Americans would later launch the liberation of Europe, and a symbol that Nazi Germany was not invincible. But Britain was still very much alone, clinging on, enduring, but unable to strike back in any meaningful way. Churchill knew Britain couldn't win without allies. He looked west, across the Atlantic, to the one nation with the industrial might and resources to tip the balance, the United States of America. But in 1940, America wanted nothing to do with another European war. The trauma of World War I, the Great Depression, and a strong isolationist sentiment meant that most Americans preferred to stay out of the conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt privately sympathized with Britain and loathed Nazi Germany, but he was constrained by public opinion and neutrality laws. The best he could do was push through measures like the Destroyers 4 Bases deal, trading 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for leases on British military bases, and Lend-Lease, which allowed Britain to obtain American weapons and supplies on credit. America was, as Roosevelt put it, becoming the arsenal of democracy, but it wasn't yet willing to send troops. That would require a different catalyst, one that would come from an entirely different direction. While Britain endured the Blitz, Hitler was already planning his next grand move, the one that would ultimately doom him, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler had always intended to attack the Soviets. It was central to his entire ideology. Communism was the enemy. The Slavic peoples were to be enslaved or exterminated to make room for German settlers. The vast resources of the Soviet Union, the oil of the Caucasus, the grain of Ukraine, the Lebensraum he'd always dreamed of, beckoned. The Nazi-Soviet pact had only ever been a tactical convenience. Now, with Western Europe secure and Britain neutralized, if not defeated, Hitler turned east. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. It was the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German troops, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and Finnish forces, attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Over 3,000 tanks and 2,500 aircraft participated in the initial assault. The Germans were organized into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North aimed for Leningrad. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow. Army Group South targeted Kiev and Ukraine. The Soviets, despite numerous intelligence warnings from sources, including the famous spy Richard Sorge, were caught almost completely by surprise. Stalin had refused to believe Hitler would attack so soon, dismissing warnings as British provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into the war. It was one of history's most catastrophic intelligence failures. The initial German advance was staggering. Using the same blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Poland and France, German forces encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in massive encirclement battles at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft, many caught on the ground. By October, Army Group Center was within sight of Moscow's outskirts. German soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Victory seemed within grasp, but the Soviet Union wasn't France. First, the sheer size of the Soviet Union worked against the Germans. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles over primitive roads that turned to impassable mud when the autumn rains came. Second, Soviet resistance, though often poorly organized, was fanatical. Entire units fought to the death. Cities like Brest Fortress held out for weeks despite being surrounded and cut off. Third, Stalin, after recovering from his initial shock, rallied the country. This wasn't framed as a war to defend communism, but as the Great Patriotic War, defending Mother Russia from invaders. Fourth, the Soviets had more reserves than the Germans anticipated. Factories were being evacuated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach, where they would continue producing tanks, planes, and weapons. And fifth, winter was coming. The German military had planned for a quick campaign. They'd expected to defeat the Soviet Union in a matter of months before the onset of winter. They hadn't equipped their troops for a Russian winter. So when temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms. Weapons froze. Tank engines wouldn't start. Men suffered from frostbite and hypothermia. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, equipped for the cold and bolstered by fresh divisions from Siberia, launched a massive counteroffensive in December 1941. The Battle of Moscow raged through the brutal winter. German forces were pushed back from the Soviet capital. It was the first major German retreat of the war. Barbarossa had failed. Germany was now locked in a war of attrition in the East, the very thing Hitler had wanted to avoid. But December 1941 brought another seismic shift in the war, one that would ultimately seal the Axis powers' fate. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At 7:48 in the morning, Japanese aircraft carriers launched waves of bombers and torpedo planes that caught the American battleships moored in the harbor completely off guard. In less than 2 hours, 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The attack was a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe for Japan. Yes, they'd temporarily crippled the American battleship fleet. But crucially, they'd missed the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea. More importantly, they'd awakened a sleeping giant. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and asking for a declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. America's isolationism evaporated overnight. The country mobilized for total war with a speed and determination that stunned the world. And then, in a move that still baffles historians, Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11th. He wasn't obligated to do so under his alliance with Japan. But he did it anyway, perhaps believing America was already a de facto enemy, perhaps hoping Japan would reciprocate by attacking the Soviet Union in the East. Japan didn't. Hitler had just handed Roosevelt the political gift of a lifetime and ensured that America's massive industrial capacity would be turned against Germany. The war was now truly global. In Europe, North Africa, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and Asia, millions of men fought and died. Let's shift to North Africa, where a different kind of war was being waged. Italy, Germany's hapless ally, had bungled an invasion of Egypt from their colony in Libya. The British had counterattacked and pushed the Italians back hundreds of miles. Hitler, forced to bail out his ally, sent the Afrika Korps under the command of Erwin Rommel, who would become known as the Desert Fox. Rommel was a brilliant tactician, and he turned the tables on the British, driving them back to the Egyptian border. For over a year, the war in North Africa swung back and forth across the desert. Towns like Tobruk changed hands multiple times. Tank battles raged across the sand. It was a strange, almost gentlemanly war compared to the Eastern Front, with both sides generally respecting the rules of war and treating prisoners decently. Meanwhile, the war at sea was a desperate struggle for survival. Germany's U-boats, submarines, prowled the Atlantic, hunting the convoys that brought vital supplies from America to Britain. Hundreds of merchant ships were sent to the bottom. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of attrition, technology, and intelligence. The Allies developed better convoy tactics, long-range aircraft to cover the mid-Atlantic gap, and, crucially, cracked the German Enigma code, allowing them to route convoys around U-boat Wolfpacks. The Germans developed better torpedoes and tactics. Thousands of sailors on both sides died in the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic. It was a battle Britain absolutely had to win. If the sea lanes were cut, Britain would starve and be unable to continue the war. Back on the Eastern Front, 1940 brought new German offensives. Unable to attack along the entire front, Hitler focused on the south, aiming to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The city bore Stalin's name, which gave it symbolic importance. Army Group South drove deep into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1942, making impressive gains. By late summer, German forces reached Stalingrad and began the battle that would become the turning point of the entire war. And then, in November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that encircled the entire German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Over 250,000 German and Axis troops were trapped. Hitler ordered them to hold, forbidding retreat, promising that the Luftwaffe would supply them by air. Göring assured Hitler it could be done. It couldn't. The Luftwaffe lacked the capacity to supply an entire army by air, especially through Soviet anti-aircraft fire and winter weather. The surrounded Germans slowly starved and froze. An attempted relief operation failed. By late January 1943, the situation was hopeless. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 91,000 Germans who went into Soviet captivity, only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad was catastrophic for Germany. An entire army, one of its best, was annihilated. German casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, exceeded 800,000. Soviet casualties were even higher, perhaps over 1 million, but the Soviets had reserves. Germany didn't. More importantly, the aura of German invincibility was shattered. The Wehrmacht could be beaten. The tide was turning. And it wasn't just turning in the east. In North Africa, the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery defeated Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942, driving the Afrika Korps into retreat. Then, in November, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, opening a second front in North Africa. The Axis forces were now trapped between Montgomery advancing from the east and the Americans and British advancing from the west. By May 1943, all Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops went into captivity. North Africa was cleared. The Allies now had a springboard into southern Europe. In July 1943, British, American, and Canadian forces invaded Sicily in Operation Husky. The island fell in a little over a month. Mussolini, Hitler's fascist Italian counterpart, was overthrown by his own government in a coup. Italy, never enthusiastic about the war, switched sides and surrendered to the Allies in September 1943. German forces immediately occupied Italy, disarmed the Italian military, and prepared to defend the peninsula. The Italian campaign would become a brutal slog up the mountainous spine of Italy, far more costly and time-consuming than the Allies had anticipated. But Italy was now out of the Axis, and Germany faced growing pressure from all sides. By 1943, the noose was tightening around Nazi Germany, but Hitler refused to consider surrender. Instead, he doubled down, convinced that wonder weapons and iron will would somehow turn the tide. The German war machine, despite being battered on multiple fronts, remained dangerous and deadly. On the Eastern Front, after the disaster at Stalingrad, the Germans attempted one more major offensive. In July 1943, at a place called Kursk, the largest tank battle in history erupted. Hitler had delayed the offensive repeatedly, wanting newer, better tanks. This gave the Soviets time to prepare. They knew the attack was coming courtesy of intelligence from the Lucy spy ring and other sources, and they built defensive lines of unimaginable depth. Minefields stretched for miles. Anti-tank ditches crisscrossed the landscape. Artillery was pre-positioned. When the Germans finally attacked on July 5th, they ran straight into a meat grinder. The Battle of Kursk involved over 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, and over 2 million men. For 2 weeks, armored behemoths clashed in the summer heat. Villages changed hands multiple times. The newest German Tigers and Panthers fought Soviet T-34s in desperate battles. But the German advance stalled. They couldn't break through. And when the Soviets launched their counteroffensive, it was the Germans who retreated. Kursk was the last German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From that point forward, the Soviets had the initiative. They would keep it all the way to Berlin. The Red Army, which had been nearly destroyed in 1941, had learned from its catastrophic defeats. Soviet generals like Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky, and Ivan Konev had become masters of deep operations, massive offensives that punched through German lines and encircled entire armies. Soviet tank production outstripped Germany's by a massive margin. The T-34, simple, rugged, and effective, rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Soviet artillery, massed in unprecedented concentrations, pulverized German positions. And Soviet manpower, despite horrific losses, seemed inexhaustible. For every German division, the Soviets could field 3 or 4. The Red Army began its relentless drive west. Ukraine was liberated in late 1943. The siege of Leningrad, which had lasted 900 days and killed over 1 million civilians through starvation and bombardment, was finally broken in January 1944. By the summer of 1944, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration, timed to coincide with the Allied invasion of France. Bagration was devastatingly successful. Army Group Center, the same force that had almost taken Moscow, was ripped apart. Over 350,000 German casualties in a matter of weeks. Belarus was liberated. The Red Army reached Poland. The scale of Soviet operations dwarfed anything in the West, while Western historians often focus on D-Day. The reality is that the vast majority of German forces and the vast majority of German casualties were on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were doing the heavy lifting, and they were paying for it in rivers of blood. But let's rewind slightly and shift our focus to the Pacific, because while Europe grabbed headlines, a parallel war of equal brutality was raging across Asia and the Pacific Islands. After Pearl Harbor, Japan had gone on a rampage. Within months, they'd conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and countless Pacific islands. The British garrison at Singapore, supposedly an impregnable fortress, surrendered to a smaller Japanese force in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. American and Filipino forces in the Philippines held out longer, with General Douglas MacArthur evacuated to Australia, where he made his famous promise, "I shall return." The troops he left behind fought desperately on the Bataan Peninsula before being forced to surrender in April 1942. What followed was the Bataan Death March, where over 70,000 American and Filipino POWs were force-marched 65 miles in brutal heat with no food or water. Thousands died or were murdered by their captors. It was a war crime on a massive scale, and it hardened American resolve. But Japan's expansion reached its limit. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, American and Japanese carriers fought the first naval battle where the surface ships never saw each other. Everything was done by aircraft. The Japanese advance toward Australia was checked. Then, in June 1942, came Midway, the battle that changed the Pacific War. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval codes and knew an attack was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz set a trap. Near Midway at all, American carriers ambushed the Japanese fleet. In a single day, June 4, 1942, American dive bombers sank for Japanese fleet carriers. Japan lost over 300 aircraft and many of its best pilots. The Japanese Navy never recovered from Midway. The strategic initiative passed to the Americans. The American strategy in the Pacific involved two parallel offensives. Admiral Nimitz would island hop across the central Pacific, seizing key islands and bypassing others, letting them wither on the vine. General MacArthur would advance through the southwest Pacific, retaking the Philippines. Each island captured brought American bombers closer to Japan itself. But taking those islands was a nightmare. Japanese forces, indoctrinated with Bushido, the warrior code, almost never surrendered. They fought to the death, often launching suicidal banzai charges against American positions. They used kamikaze tactics, deliberately crashing planes into ships. They hid in caves and tunnels, turning every island into a fortress. Guadalcanal, the first American offensive, lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. Marines landed on this obscure island in the Solomon Islands and found themselves in a 6-month battle through jungles and swamps against an enemy that refused to quit. Naval battles off the island were so frequent and brutal that the waters became known as Iron Batam Sound because of all the ships sunk there. American forces eventually prevailed, but at a high cost. It set the pattern for the Pacific War: slow, bloody advances, island by island, against an enemy that would rather die than surrender. Tarawa in November 1943 shocked America. This tiny atoll took 3 days to capture and cost over 3,000 American casualties. The Japanese defenders, numbering less than 5,000, fought almost to the last man. Only 17 were captured alive, most of them wounded. Images of dead Marines floating in the lagoon brought the brutal reality of the Pacific War home to Americans. And Tarawa was just the beginning. Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each name became synonymous with savage fighting. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marines fought for over a month to capture an island 8 square miles in size. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi became one of the most famous images of the war. But that photo was taken on the 5th day of a battle that lasted 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Americans died taking Iwo Jima. 21,000 Japanese defenders died. Only 216 were captured. Okinawa was even worse. From April to June 1945, American forces fought to capture this island just 350 miles from mainland Japan. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Over 12,000 Americans died. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. And tragically, somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died, caught in the crossfire, used as human shields by Japanese forces, or committing suicide because they'd been told the Americans would torture and kill them. Kamikaze attacks reached a frenzy during Okinawa. Over 1,900 kamikaze missions sank dozens of ships and killed nearly 5,000 American sailors. The fanaticism of Japanese resistance at Okinawa convinced American planners that invading the Japanese home islands would cost millions of casualties on both sides. Back in Europe, the Allies were preparing for the most ambitious amphibious operation in history, the invasion of France. Stalin had been demanding a second front for years, arguing that the Soviets were bearing the brunt of the fighting against Germany. He was right, but mounting an invasion across the English Channel was an enormous undertaking. It required air superiority, naval superiority, millions of tons of supplies, specialized landing craft, extensive training, and meticulous planning. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Allied Commander, tasked with the nearly impossible job of coordinating American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces for the invasion. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They didn't know where or when. Hitler and his generals debated whether the Allies would land at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel, or elsewhere. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now commanding German defenses in France, worked frantically to fortify the coast, planting millions of mines and obstacles on the beaches. But German forces were stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts, and their defenses, though formidable, had gaps. The Allies mounted an elaborate deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, convincing the Germans that the main invasion would hit Calais. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks and landing craft visible to German reconnaissance, and double agents fed false information to German intelligence. It worked. Even after the real invasion began, Hitler kept significant forces at Calais waiting for what he believed would be the main attack. June 6, 1944. D-Day, shortly after midnight, Allied paratroopers dropped behind German lines in Normandy to secure key bridges and crossroads. At dawn, over 5,000 ships approached the Normandy coast. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Naval guns pounded German positions. And then, on 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, over 150,000 Allied troops stormed ashore. At Utah, American forces faced light resistance and secured the beach quickly. At Gold, Juneau, and Sword, British and Canadian forces fought through German defenses and linked up. But at Omaha Beach, everything went wrong. The American assault on Omaha was a bloodbath. German defenders, positioned on bluffs overlooking the beach, had perfect fields of fire. Many landing craft hit sandbars and obstacles, forcing troops to wade through deep water under murderous fire. Tanks equipped with flotation devices sank. Artillery support fell short. The beach became a killing zone. Men huddled behind obstacles, pinned down, watching their comrades die. For a few hours, it looked like Omaha might fail completely. But small groups of soldiers, led by junior officers and NCOs, began moving. They found gaps in the wire. They knocked out German bunkers. Slowly, painfully, they fought their way off the beach. By nightfall, Omaha was secure, but over 2,000 Americans were casualties. It was the bloodiest of the D-Day beaches and a testament to the courage of the men who fought there. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had a foothold in France. Over 150,000 troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted coastal defenses, had been breached. But the battle for Normandy was just beginning. German reinforcements rushed toward the invasion area. For 6 weeks, Allied forces fought through the Norman hedgerows, dense thickets, and sunken lanes that turned the countryside into a defender's paradise. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties mounted. The ancient city of Caen, which was supposed to fall on D-Day, wasn't fully secured until mid-July. But the Allies kept feeding men and material across the Channel. They had overwhelming air superiority. German counterattacks were blasted apart by fighter bombers before they could even reach Allied lines. In late July, American forces broke out at Saint-Lay in Operation Cobra. General George Patton's Third Army raced across France, bypassing German strongpoints, liberating town after town. The Germans attempted to counterattack at Mortain, but were decimated. A large German force was trapped in the Falaise pocket and pounded into submission by Allied air and artillery. By late August, Paris was liberated, with Free French forces, backed by American units, entering the city to rapturous crowds. After 4 years of occupation, France was free. The Allies continued driving east toward Germany. By September, they'd liberated Belgium and Luxembourg. American forces crossed the German border. Victory seemed close, but it wasn't. The Allied advance outran its supply lines. Fuel and ammunition were in short supply. The Germans, fighting on their own soil with their backs to the wall, resisted fiercely. An ambitious plan to end the war in 1944, Operation Market Garden, attempted to seize bridges across rivers in the Netherlands, creating a route into Germany's industrial heartland. British paratroopers landed at Arnhem, the farthest bridge, and found themselves surrounded by German panzer divisions that intelligence had missed. For 9 days, they held out, waiting for relief that never came. Most were killed or captured. Market Garden was a costly failure. The war would continue into 1945. In December 1944, Hitler launched one last desperate gamble in the West. The Battle of the Bulge began with a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. The same route that had worked so well in 1940. German forces, including elite SS panzer divisions, punched through American lines, creating a bulge in the Allied front. Hitler's goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West so he could focus on the Soviets. It was fantasy. Germany no longer had the resources for such an offensive. But it was dangerous nonetheless. The initial German assault achieved complete surprise. American units, many of them inexperienced or resting, were overrun. At Malmedy, SS troops murdered 84 American POWs in a war crime that infuriated Allied forces. At Bastogne, American paratroopers and other units were surrounded. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply: nuts. The defenders held out, eventually relieved by Patton's forces. The weather, which had been overcast, grounding Allied aircraft, cleared. Allied fighter bombers and artillery pounded German columns. By late January, the bulge was eliminated. The Germans had lost hundreds of tanks and aircraft they couldn't replace. The offensive had delayed the Allied advance, but ultimately hastened Germany's defeat by exhausting reserves that could have been used defending the Rhine. By early 1945, Germany was doomed. In the east, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January, advancing from Poland to within 40 miles of Berlin in a matter of weeks. German forces in the east were collapsing. In the west, British, American, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine in March. Germany was being invaded from both directions. Allied bombers roamed the skies at will. Cities like Dresden were incinerated in firestorms that killed tens of thousands. Germany's infrastructure was destroyed. Oil supplies were gone. The Luftwaffe was reduced to impotence. Yet Hitler, now living in his bunker beneath Berlin, refused to surrender. He issued orders to non-existent armies. He ranted about betrayal. He clung to delusional hopes that his relationship with the Western Allies would fracture, that new super weapons would turn the tide. Those super weapons did exist in some form. Germany had developed the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, terror weapons that rained down on London and Antwerp. The V-2 was the world's first ballistic missile, a technological marvel that killed thousands but came too late to affect the war's outcome. Germany was also developing jet aircraft like the Me-262, which was faster than any Allied fighter. But these weapons were produced into few numbers and deployed too late. They were symptoms of Nazi Germany's tendency toward complex, expensive wonder weapons instead of mass-producing simpler, effective designs. In Italy, Allied forces finally broke through the Gothic line in April 1945. Mussolini, who'd been ruling a German puppet state in northern Italy, tried to flee to Switzerland but was captured by Italian partisans. On April 28, 1945, he and his mistress were executed and their bodies hung upside down in Milan for public display. Italy's fascist dictator met an ignoble end. In Germany, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River on April 25th, cutting Germany in two. Berlin was encircled by Soviet forces. The Red Army, seeking revenge for the devastation inflicted on their homeland, fought their way into the German capital in brutal street-to-street combat. Hitler, in his bunker, finally faced reality. On April 29th, he married his longtime companion Eva Braun. On April 30th, as Soviet soldiers fought within blocks of the bunker, Hitler dictated his final testament, blaming everyone but himself for Germany's defeat, and then committed suicide along with Eva. His body was burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden. On May 2nd, Soviet forces completed the capture of Berlin. Hitler's thousand-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 4 months. German forces began surrendering en masse. Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named as his successor, realized the war was lost. On May 7, 1945, at General Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, German representatives signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender. May 8th was declared Victory in Europe Day, V-Day. After nearly 6 years of war, the fighting in Europe was over. Cities across the Allied world erupted in celebration. But the joy was tempered by the knowledge that millions had died and that in the Pacific, the war continued. While Europe celebrated V-Day, the war in the Pacific ground on with undiminished ferocity. Japan's situation was hopeless, but surrender was unthinkable within the military culture that dominated Japanese leadership. The home islands were now under constant attack. American B-29 Super Fortress bombers, flying from bases in the Mariana Islands, were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The firebombing campaign, directed by General Curtis LeMay, was horrifically effective. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, over 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would later kill. 16 square miles of the city were reduced to ash. Survivors described rivers boiling, canals filled with corpses, and heat so intense that people spontaneously combusted. Tokyo wasn't alone. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of other cities suffered similar fates. By the summer of 1945, Japan's urban areas were largely destroyed. The economy was in ruins. The merchant fleet had been sunk by American submarines, strangling the island nation's access to resources. Millions were starving. The military was exhausted. Yet the Japanese government, dominated by military hardliners, refused to accept unconditional surrender. They still held out hope for a negotiated peace, one that would preserve the imperial system and avoid occupation. They were delusional. The Allies had made clear at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945 that only unconditional surrender was acceptable. American planners were preparing Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. It would be a two-phase operation. Olympic would invade Kyushu, the southernmost main island, in November 1945. Coronet would invade the main island of Honshu, near Tokyo, in March 1946. Casualty estimates were staggering. Some predictions suggested 500,000 American casualties, possibly more. Japanese casualties would be in the millions. The entire civilian population was being mobilized to resist. School children were being trained to attack landing craft with bamboo spears. Thousands of aircraft were being preserved for kamikaze attacks. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa suggested that the Japanese would fight with suicidal determination for every inch of their homeland. An invasion would be Okinawa multiplied 100-fold. It was a prospect that filled American commanders with dread, but there was an alternative, a weapon so powerful that it might shock Japan into surrender without an invasion. The Manhattan Project, one of history's most ambitious scientific endeavors, had been developing an atomic bomb in utmost secrecy since 1942. led by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and backed by billions of dollars in funding. Thousands of scientists and engineers had worked at secret facilities in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington to unlock the power of the atom. The physics was extraordinarily complex, requiring the enrichment of uranium-235 and the creation of plutonium-239, elements that barely existed in nature. Two types of bombs were developed: a uranium gun-type bomb called Little Boy and a plutonium implosion-type bomb called Fat Man. On July 16, 1945, at the Trinity Test Site in New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was detonated. The explosion, equivalent to 20 kilotons of TNT, lit up the pre-dawn darkness with a light brighter than 1,000 suns. A mushroom cloud rose over 7 miles into the atmosphere. The steel tower supporting the bomb vaporized. The desert sand beneath Ground Zero was fused into radioactive glass. Oppenheimer, witnessing the test, famously recalled a line from Hindu scripture: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The scientists had succeeded in harnessing the fundamental forces of the universe for destruction. The question now was whether to use it. President Harry Truman, who'd assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, faced an agonizing decision. He could authorize the use of atomic bombs against Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, but potentially ending the war without an invasion. Or he could continue conventional warfare, which was already killing thousands daily, leading to an invasion that would kill millions. There was also consideration given to demonstrating the bomb's power on an uninhabited island, inviting Japanese observers, but this was rejected. There were only 2 bombs available, and there was no guarantee that a demonstration would convince Japan's military leadership. Moreover, if a demonstration failed to detonate, it would be a propaganda disaster. Truman authorized the use of atomic bombs against Japanese cities. A list of potential targets was drawn up, focusing on cities that had military significance but had been largely untouched by conventional bombing, to demonstrate the bomb's power. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was initially on the list, but was removed due to its cultural significance thanks to the insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Hiroshima, a major military port and headquarters for the defense of southern Japan, was selected as the primary target. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian Island carrying Little Boy. The flight to Hiroshima took 6 hours. The city below was going about its morning routine. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier when weather reconnaissance planes passed over, but the all-clear had been given. At 8:15 a.m. local time, at an altitude of 31,000 feet, the bomb was released. It fell for 43 seconds. At 1,968 feet above the city, it detonated. The fireball was 1,800 feet across with a temperature at its core of several million degrees. Everything within a half mile of the hypocenter was vaporized. People simply ceased to exist, their shadows permanently burned onto walls and pavement, the only evidence they had ever been there. The blast wave, traveling faster than sound, flattened buildings for miles. Fires ignited across the city, fed by broken gas mains and overturned stoves. A black rain, filled with radioactive particles, fell on the outskirts. Of Hiroshima's population of 350,000, approximately 70,000 died instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll from acute injuries and radiation sickness would reach 140,000. Survivors, the Hibakusha, would suffer from radiation-related illnesses for the rest of their lives. The Japanese government was stunned but still didn't surrender. Some military leaders argued that America couldn't have many such bombs and that Japan should continue fighting. They didn't know that a second bomb was already being prepared. On August 8th, the Soviet Union, honoring a promise made to the Allies, declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese forces in a matter of days. Stalin wanted to ensure the Soviets would have a say in post-war Asia. The Japanese now faced enemies on all sides. On August 9, 1945, a second B-29 boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, took off for the city of Kokura carrying Fat Man. Kokura was obscured by clouds and smoke, so the plane diverted to its secondary target, Nagasaki, a port city on Kyushu. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated at 1,650 feet above the city. The explosion was even more powerful than Hiroshima, equivalent to 21 kilotons of TNT, but Nagasaki's hilly terrain limited the blast's spread. Still, approximately 74,000 people died, roughly 40,000 immediately, and the rest by the end of the year. Japan's leaders met in an emergency session. The Supreme Council for the direction of the war was deadlocked. Half wanted to continue fighting, half wanted to surrender. The unprecedented step was taken of asking Emperor Hirohito himself to decide. In the early hours of August 10th, the emperor made his decision. Japan would surrender on the condition that the imperial institution be preserved. The Allies agreed to this with the caveat that the emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people via radio, the first time most had ever heard his voice. In formal, archaic Japanese, he announced that Japan would endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable and accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur, who'd been appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, presided. Japanese representatives, including Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, signed the instrument of surrender. Representatives of the Allied nations signed as witnesses. World War II was finally definitively over. After 6 years and 1 day, the deadliest conflict in human history had ended. The silence that fell was deafening. The cost was almost incomprehensible. Between 70 and 85 million people were dead. The Soviet Union alone lost 27 million, nearly half of them civilians. China lost 15 to 20 million. Germany lost 7 million. Poland lost 6 million, including 3 million Jews, nearly a fifth of its entire pre-war population. Japan lost 3 million. The Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others in a genocide of industrial efficiency. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Refugees numbered in the tens of millions. Economies were shattered. The old world order was gone, replaced by a new reality dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, who had been allies of convenience and would soon become Cold War adversaries. The war reshaped the world in ways that are still felt today. The United Nations was created, an attempt to build a forum for resolving international disputes without resorting to war, learning from the League of Nations failures. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, establishing principles that genocide and crimes against humanity could never again be dismissed as internal affairs. The Nuremberg trials and Tokyo trials established the precedent that individuals, even heads of state, could be held accountable for war crimes and crimes against peace. 12 Nazi leaders were sentenced to death at Nuremberg. 7 Japanese leaders were hanged in Tokyo. Justice, imperfect as it was, had been served. Europe was divided. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it, descended across the continent. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet domination. Communist governments installed by the Red Army. Western Europe, rebuilt with American aid through the Marshall Plan, became democratic and capitalist. Germany itself was divided into East and West, a split that would last until 1989. Berlin, deep in the Soviet zone, was also divided, becoming a flashpoint of Cold War tensions. The division of Europe would define international politics for the next 45 years. In Asia, the situation was equally complex. Japan, occupied by American forces under MacArthur, underwent a profound transformation. War crime trials executed some leaders while sparing others, including Emperor Hirohito, who was deemed necessary for maintaining stability. A new constitution, drafted largely by Americans, renounced war and established Japan as a pacifist democracy. Land reform broke up the old feudal estates. Women gained the right to vote. Japan would emerge from the ashes of defeat to become an economic powerhouse, though the scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would never fully heal. China descended into civil war between Mao Zedong's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, a conflict that had been suspended during the war against Japan. By 1949, the communists had won, establishing the People's Republic of China. The nationalists fled to Taiwan. Korea, occupied by Japan during the war, was divided along the 38th parallel between Soviet and American zones, a temporary measure that became permanent, leading to the Korean War and a division that persists today. Vietnam, also occupied by Japan, saw the rise of Ho Chi Minh's independence movement, setting the stage for decades of conflict with France and later America. The British and French colonial empires, weakened by the war, began to crumble. India gained independence in 1947, though partition into India and Pakistan resulted in horrific violence and millions of refugees. Indonesia, the Philippines, and other colonies across Asia and Africa would gain independence in the following decades. The age of European imperialism was ending, though the process was often bloody and painful. The atomic age had begun, and with it a new existential threat. The Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted, thanks in part to Soviet espionage. The nuclear arms race was underway. By the 1960s, both superpowers possessed thermonuclear weapons thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The concept of mutually assured destruction, the idea that any nuclear war would result in the annihilation of both sides, became the grim foundation of Cold War deterrence. Humanity now possessed the capability to destroy itself completely, multiple times over. But World War II also demonstrated humanity's capacity for resilience, courage, and sacrifice. Ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, performed acts of heroism that defy imagination. Resistance fighters across occupied Europe sabotaged Nazi operations, hid Jews from the Holocaust, and paid with their lives. The soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy, who froze in the foxholes of Bastogne, who island hopped across the Pacific, many of them teenagers barely out of high school, stopped tyranny at incalculable cost. The workers, especially women, who filled factories and kept the home front running while their men were at war, proved that total war required total national effort. The scientists who developed radar, proximity fuses, antibiotics, and yes, the atomic bomb demonstrated that technology could be both savior and destroyer. The lessons of World War II are uncomfortable and complex. It showed that democracies, when pushed, can mobilize and fight with determination equal to any dictatorship. It showed that evil, real systematic evil, can take hold in advanced civilized nations, that education and culture are no safeguards against barbarity. It showed that appeasement of aggression only invites more aggression, that peace at any price usually results in war at the worst possible time. It showed that total war between industrial powers results in total devastation, that civilian populations become targets, that technology increases killing efficiency beyond previous imagination. It also showed that alliances, even between nations with vastly different ideologies and interests, can achieve the impossible when facing a common existential threat. The alliance between the democratic West and the communist Soviet Union was never comfortable. Stalin and Churchill detested each other. Roosevelt tried to bridge the gap but died before seeing the war's end. Yet, they cooperated because the alternative, Nazi domination of Europe and Japanese domination of Asia, was unacceptable to all of them. Perhaps most importantly, World War II showed that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, that tyranny must be opposed early and firmly, that waiting until the threat is overwhelming makes victory exponentially more costly. The failure to stop Hitler when he remilitarized the Rhineland, when he annexed Austria, when he took the Sudetenland, meant that stopping him later required a global war that killed tens of millions. It's a lesson that subsequent generations have struggled to apply, sometimes overlearning it and seeing Hitlers where there are none, sometimes underlearning it and ignoring genuine threats until too late. The world that emerged from World War II was unrecognizable from the world that entered it. Empires had fallen, new superpowers had risen. Technology had leapt forward by decades. Nuclear weapons ensured that another total war between major powers would likely be humanity's last. The international order established in 1945, the United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods financial system shaped the remainder of the 20th century and continues to shape the 21st. The veterans of World War II, dubbed the greatest generation by journalist Tom Brokaw, returned home and built the post-war world. They created suburbs, attended college on the G-bill, started businesses, raised families, and largely refused to talk about what they'd experienced. The trauma was too great, the memories too painful. Many took their stories to their graves, but their sacrifices created a world of unprecedented prosperity and peace, at least for the victorious nations. The long boom of the post-war decades, the expansion of civil rights, the technological revolutions of computers and space exploration all rested on the foundation they laid. Yet we must remember that not everyone experienced the post-war period as liberation and prosperity. Millions remained under Soviet oppression. Colonial subjects still fought for freedom. The atomic bombs cast a shadow that still haunts us. The Holocaust revealed depths of human evil that shattered faith in progress and civilization. The firebombing of cities, the strategic bombing campaigns, raised moral questions about whether the ends justified the means, whether total war against entire populations could ever be ethical. Standing here, decades removed from those terrible years, we live in a world that World War II made. The international institutions, the alliances, the technologies, the political divisions, the very language we use to discuss international relations, all bear its stamp. When we talk about appeasement, we're thinking of Munich. When we discuss genocide, we're thinking of Auschwitz. When we debate the use of military force, we're weighing the lessons of Pearl Harbor against the shadow of Hiroshima. When we consider the cost of freedom, we remember Normandy and Stalingrad and Midway. The Second World War was the deadliest conflict in human history. It was also the last time the forces of democracy and the forces of totalitarian dictatorship met in open, total combat. And democracy won, though at a cost that still staggers the imagination. 70 to 85 million people paid the ultimate price. Hundreds of millions more bore physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Entire cities, entire cultures were erased from the map. But from that crucible of fire and blood came a determination that it must never happen again, that the international community had a responsibility to prevent genocide, that aggressive war was a crime, that human rights transcended national sovereignty. These principles, imperfectly applied, and often honored more in the breach than in the observance, nevertheless represent humanity's attempt to learn from its darkest hour. As the last veterans of World War to pass away, as the living memory of those years fades, the responsibility falls on the rest of us to remember. To remember the cost of freedom, to remember what happens when good people do nothing. To remember that tyranny, once established, is exponentially harder to uproot. To remember that war, even just war, even necessary war, is hell and should always be the last resort. To remember the individuals, the millions upon millions of individuals, each with hopes and dreams and families, who died. They weren't statistics. They were people. World War II didn't just reshape the world. It revealed fundamental truths about human nature, both the heights of heroism and the depths of depravity we're capable of. It showed that civilization is fragile, that it can be destroyed in a generation if we're not careful. It showed that when pressed, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. It showed that evil must be confronted, that neutrality in the face of oppression is complicity. The conflict that began with a staged attack on a German radio station and ended with mushroom clouds over Japanese cities killed 3% of everyone alive on Earth. 3%. Think about that. If you knew 100 people, 3 of them would be dead. It mobilized over 100 million military personnel. It cost over $4 trillion in today's money. It saw the first use of jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and nuclear weapons. It murdered 6 million Jews in an industrialized genocide. It killed 27 million Soviets, most of them civilians. It firebombed cities into ash. It turned entire continents into battlefields. And from those ashes, we built the world we inhabit today. A world where, despite its many problems, major powers haven't fought a direct war in nearly 80 years. A world where genocide is recognized as a crime against humanity. A world where international law, however imperfectly, seeks to constrain the use of force. A world where the horrors of total war are seared into our collective memory, a warning to future generations. World War II was the deadliest conflict that reshaped the world forever. Its shadow still falls across our present. Its lessons, paid for in millions of lives, remain relevant. The question is whether we have the wisdom to remember them, the courage to apply them, and the humility to understand that the price of forgetting would be catastrophic beyond measure. Because if we forget, if we let the memory fade, if we fail to teach the next generation why those millions died and what they died for, we risk repeating history's darkest chapter. And next time, with nuclear weapons spread across the globe, there might not be anyone left to remember at all.